believe this stuff. So I will conclude, despite the fact that I still have over 30 seconds in which I could expatiate on some of these things, by suggesting to you that if the garden of God is the place where the very fact of wanting knowledge, eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge, is a mortal sin that we've had to pay for ever since, and that God had to torture himself in order to expatiate. What kind of a story is that? We're well out of that garden. Thank you.
You'll remember that in my first speech I said I would defend two main contentions in tonight's debate. The first of which was that there's no good reason to think that atheism is true. Now, in his opening speech, Dr. de Sousa, I think, could get a prize for rhetoric if we were competing in that. But it's very difficult to discern exactly his arguments because the premises of his arguments weren't very clearly presented. But I discerned basically 5 arguments in that opening speech against the existence of God. Let me attempt to respond to these as best I can. Number 1, the definition of God entails that he doesn't exist. And here he does a parody of the ontological argument. The ontological argument is an argument that says that as the greatest conceivable being, God would exist in all possible worlds. So that if God's existence is even possible, it follows that he exists in all possible worlds and therefore in the actual world. I think the ontological argument is a sound argument for the existence of God, and so I'm going to add it to the 5 that I've already presented. But what Dr. de Sousa says is, we can parody this by saying there's an even greater God than the God of the ontological argument, namely a God who doesn't exist and who manages to create everything. The problem with that is that a God who doesn't exist is a logical incoherence. It is logically self-contradictory to say there is a being which does not exist. There is no possible world which contains a being that doesn't exist. And therefore this isn't parallel to the ontological argument. It is in fact a logical incoherence which does nothing to show either that the ontological argument is unsound or that God does not exist. Second argument that he suggests seems to be the argument from evil and imperfection in the world. And here I need to correct a misimpression. The theist is not committed to the view that this is the best of all possible worlds. Leibniz may have held that, but almost no other theist believes that. Indeed, the idea of a best of all possible worlds may be a logically incoherent idea. The scale of possible worlds may simply go on without any sort of maximum value. You could always add better things and get better and better, so that God is simply required to create a world that is on balance good. It may be a logical incoherence to talk about a best of all possible worlds. In any case, if Dr. de Sousa is maintaining that there's some sort of a logical contradiction between the propositions God exists and evil and suffering exist, then he bears the burden of proof of showing that contradiction. Those are not explicitly contradictory. If the atheist wants to say they're implicitly contradictory, then he must be assuming some hidden premises that would bring out that contradiction and make it explicit. But no atheist has ever been able to successfully identify what those hidden premises are. So I will simply wait for Dr. Sousa's response. In fact, I can actually prove that those are compatible by adding a third premise, namely, God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil that exists. As long as that's even possible, it shows that God and evil are not logically incompatible. So the atheist would have to show that it is impossible for God to have morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil in the world, and that's an enormous burden of proof that no atheist has ever been able to bear. The third argument that he gives is a cluster of arguments that are united by their common commission of the genetic fallacy, namely the argument that religious belief is due to a hyperactive agency detection advice, that God is a comfort, and that where you were born determines what you believe. All of these commit the genetic fallacy, which tries to invalidate a belief by showing how the belief originated. And that, as he knows, is simply a logical fallacy. The fact is, we still have to ask ourselves what justification is there for these beliefs, and that is independent of how the belief came to originate. The fourth argument is a cluster of arguments against the God of the Bible, even though that isn't the topic tonight. He says that first, God cannot be the source of moral values because then the good will be arbitrary. Not at all. I maintain that the good is the essential nature of God. God is by nature loving, just, kind, compassionate, and so forth. And that this nature expresses itself to us in the form of divine commandments, which constitute our moral duties. So his commandments are not arbitrary, but necessary expressions of his essential nature. By contrast, as I argued in my opening speech, on the naturalist view, there are no objective moral values. There is no right and wrong. Morality is just a spin-off of the socio-biological process, and you cannot condemn Nazism, discrimination, apartheid as objectively wrong, because in an atheistic world, right and wrong do not exist. He then raises a number of biblical issues without citing the texts, without any serious attempt to do any exegesis. For example, the story of Lot's daughters being offered to the crowd to rape. God didn't command that. That was Lot's own initiative. There's nothing in that narrative that suggests that that was commanded by God. Is slavery condemned in the New Testament? Yes, it is. In the book of 1 Timothy, it condemns slave trading as being contrary to God's will. In these other cases that he mentions, he makes no serious attempt to look at them in their historical context. These did not lay down general moral principles. They were highly contingent, historically conditioned incidents which have nothing to do with a sort of general moral principle. He says, well, is hell deserving of those who do not believe? I would say in one sense, God sends nobody to hell. Rather, we separate ourselves from God irrevocably by refusing his grace and his forgiveness. And therefore he has no choice but to give us what we deserve. It is we who determine where we will spend eternity, either by embracing God's forgiveness or by spurning his grace and love and irrevocably separating ourselves from him forever. So much for the biblical arguments. The fifth argument is that life is better without God. Now I thought, who is arguing from wish fulfillment to the truth of his view? It is Dr. de Sousa who is saying, now, life is better without God, so let's live as atheists. This is appealing to atheism based on comfort. But I would say, in fact, there are lots of things that you lose if God does not exist. You lose objective meaning in life. Life becomes absurd. There is no objective meaning to life. You lose objective value in life, as I emphasized in my opening speech. Human beings are just animals, and animals are not moral agents. There is no moral right and wrong. You lose objective purpose in life. The petty plans and projects that you develop for your life are just illusory. They are not objectively the purpose of your life. They're just things you make up. So I think you lose a lot of God doesn't exist. Then he says, you're more likely to be good if you're an atheist than a theist. That is demonstrably false based on sociological studies. I have here a review of the book, Who Really Cares, by Arthur C. Brooks, which shocked people by showing that religious people are vastly more charitable, volunteer more, give blood more often, volunteer more often than do secular people. In fact, Brooks's studies completely explode the idea of the myth of the secular humanist who is good. The fact is that it is sociologically demonstrable that it is religious people who are the ones who are the most charitable, who volunteer the most, who give the most of their time for the homeless and the poor. So it is simply patently false that you're more likely to be good if you are an atheist.